Good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. It's a great pleasure to be hosting this very important media conference with some 5 selected speakers who will be talking about the Sergei Magnitsky Law and the circumstances surrounding the need for this as a matter of public policy here in Canada. My name is Tony Clement. I'm the Member of Parliament for Parry Sound Muskoka, and I am the Foreign Affairs Critic for the Conservative Party of Canada, the official opposition. Without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to our first speaker, Mr. James Bezan, who is the Member of Parliament for Selkirk Interlake Eastman, and who is the current sponsor of the Sergei Magnitsky Law.
Thanks a lot, Tony, and good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be here to talk about Bill C-267. It's a bill that has been nicknamed the Sergei Magnitsky Law, but we're calling it the Justice for Victims of Foreign Corrupt Officials Act. But Sergei Magnitsky Law is by far easier to say and remember. Now, got to give credit to Irwin Cotler, who was the first drafter of this bill. I've taken it and made a couple of changes to it. But essentially, it makes amendments to the Special Economic Measures Act and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to ensure that corrupt foreign officials who are committing human right abuses around the world can be sanctioned, both from a travel ban perspective as well as having any economic assets that they have within Canada seized. This I know we always talk about the Russian narrative as it relates to Sergei Magnitsky, and I'll let Bill go into that detail. And of course, as you know, there's a number of us on stage here that have been banned from Russia, so we aren't here, though, to just single out the abuses by corrupt Russian officials. But this also has application in other countries. And as you know, last week we had Iran Accountability Week, and that's when I tabled the bill to recognize the human rights abuses that are taking place by the Iranian regime under President Rouhani, and that there is potential for this bill, if it comes into law, to also be applied and sanctioning those individuals. We had Falun Gong doing their protest on the Hill earlier this week, and of course any of those Chinese officials who are implicated in the harvesting of organs of Falun Gong practitioners and imprisoning them and murdering them, that those as well can be sanctioned underneath this legislation. So I'm pleased that we've tabled it. I'm pleased that I've gotten the support that it has. And I'm looking forward to all party support. As you know, in the last Parliament, this bill, or there's resolutions in effect to the Sergei Magnitsky Law that was down in the United States that was unanimously supported by every member of Parliament. And we also know that in the last federal election, that the 3 main parties, Liberals, Conservatives, and NDP, all had platforms that included promises to the effect of bringing in the Sergei Magnitsky Law. So I'm glad to be the sponsor of this bill and to ensure that we broaden the scope to include other countries than just Russia. And also the other aspect of this is that it also empowers the committees of both the Senate Foreign Affairs and the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee to review this legislation, as well as review the sanctions list itself and make recommendations back to the House on an annual basis on names to be added or removed from the sanctions list. Thank you, and turn it back to Tony.
Thank you. Thank you, James, and it's my pleasure to support this bill as well. I believe I'm one of the seconders of this particular piece of legislation. I notice we've got on the stage Mr. Boris Wagnetsky. Thank you for being here. MP for Etobicoke Centre. Correct. Got that part correct anyway. Thank you for joining us as well. Our next speaker, I'm very pleased to have with us Mr. Bill Browder, who is really central to the kinds of promotion of these laws around the world. He is the head of the International Justice Campaign for Sergei Magnitsky, and he is the author of an international bestseller called Red Notice, which really depicts his time in post-Gorbachev Russia and the kinds of battles that are being waged by Democrats in that very hostile environment politically. So, Mr. Browder, welcome to our country, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation. I should say that I'm very happy to be in Canada. This is the Canadians have been with me morally and behind me in my campaign for justice for the last 6.5 years. And I want to thank James Bezan and Raynell Andrejchuk for putting forth this legislation in the House and the Senate. And I'd also like to especially thank Irwin Cotler, who has stood with me arm in arm from moments after Sergei Magnitsky was killed 6.5 years ago in a fight for justice. This legislation, the Magnitsky Act, shouldn't really need to be in place, but because of the realities of the world, it is. Sergei Magnitsky was murdered 6.5 years ago after uncovering a huge Russian government corruption scheme. Instead of punishing his murderers, the Russian government promoted them, gave them special honors, and put Sergei Magnitsky himself on trial 3 years after they killed him in the first ever posthumous trial in the history of Russia. And what became obvious is there's no possibility of getting justice in Russia for Sergei Magnitsky and many people like Sergei Magnitsky. And there's a need to do something about that. And so we looked for justice outside of Russia. And what's happened in the world over the last 30 years is that the human rights violators that used to just remain in their own countries have now fanned out across the world, taken their ill-gotten gains across the world. And from that, we realized that there is an opportunity to do something about this outside of the country where the crime is committed, which is to freeze their assets and ban their visas. The idea of freezing their assets and banning their visas has crystallized in the form of the Magnitsky Act in the United States, and it's crystallized in the form of many parliamentary resolutions around the world, including in Canada, calling on governments to do that. Because Canada has many people from that part of the world, there's been more sympathy here than just about any place for the Magnitsky Act. And because of that, when every political party was running in the last election, everybody made a promise to impose the Magnitsky Act if they came into power. I was eager the moment after the government formed to come here and hold the government to their promise, and I was told that we needed to wait till everybody was back in their seats and ready to operate, and now everybody is back in their seats and ready to operate. And so now I'm here in Canada to call on the government to fulfill their promise and to make sure that they do. My colleagues in the parliament have put in place the Magnitsky Act, which at the moment is a opposition initiative, but it shouldn't be. This should be a government initiative, and I hope it will become a government initiative. I hope that the Liberal government of Trudeau will take this, grab this initiative, and make it their own. But this is where we start today. Thank you again, and look forward to hopefully getting this done very quickly.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you again, Bill. That was exceptionally well put, and of course, we always remember the memory of the people that have suffered most greatly at the hand of the Russian government, and this is a way to honor them and to get some justice. I'm particularly pleased to introduce to you the Honorable Irwin Cotler. He has so many distinguishing characteristics in his political and academic and human rights career that we would extinguish our time at this press conference if I listed them all out. But for the purposes of this particular event, I did want to reiterate that Mr. Cotler did table the very first bill and the very first motion relating to Sergei Magnitsky. So this very much is a stepchild of Mr. Cotler in terms of his original spade work on this file, and I'm very pleased to give him the microphone at this moment.
Thank you, Tony. I'm delighted to be here at this all-party press conference, which is one of the first initiatives of the Raoul Wallenberg all-party parliamentary caucus for human rights that we established several months ago. Tony, when you mentioned about remembrance of people and Bill Browder in his remarks, as I'm standing here, I cannot help but recall that a little over 4 years ago, I stood in this very room with Boris Nemtsov, the then leader of the democratic opposition in Russia. Boris Nemtsov had come to Canada to support my private member's bill, Justice for Sergei Magnitsky at the time, but he became a leading international voice along with Bill Browder in the parliaments of the world to call for justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation. As you know, a little over a year ago, Boris Nemtsov was tragically murdered. Vladimir Kara-Murza, Boris Nemtsov's deputy, who along with Bill Browder testified before our Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights with regard to Sergei Magnitsky legislation, last May in Russia was poisoned, was in a coma, and thankfully survived. Bill Browder doesn't mention, but he has been under standing threat from the Russian authorities for spearheading this initiative. And I can go on. In a word, what Boris Nemtsov warned us about 4 years ago has only intensified since. He spoke then about the culture of corruption, of criminality, and impunity in Russia, which is why this legislation is so important. He asked us not to forget those who are standing up for human rights in Russia and paying a price for doing so. And he made a very important point, which underscores the imperative for the government today, along with the parliament, to undertake Sergei Magnitsky legislation. He said this is the most pro-Russian initiative that one can initiate. In other words, on behalf of the Russian people, and to hold the human rights violators in Russia to account. And so at a time when the Liberal government has spoken about re-engaging with the international community, if we want to re-engage, one of the ways to do so on behalf of the Russian people is to initiate and enact justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation. And this will be the best tribute that we can pay to the heroic figures like Boris Nemtsov, to people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, and to the work of Bill Browder and those around the world who are seeking to bring about not just justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation, but what it represents, justice for human rights in Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cotler. Thank you very much for those very impassioned remarks. I too knew Boris Nemtsov and heard him speak about the importance of human rights and political rights in Russia, and he is missed by many, many people. And it was a bittersweet honor to meet his daughter, Madame Nemtsova, recently as she was pressing forth for a bill such as the one that we are pursuing here today. We also have a member of the NDP caucus here, another great citizen who has spoken out frequently on the issues of human rights. And I'd like to call to the microphone Mr. Murray Rankin, who is the Member of Parliament for Victoria. Murray?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming today. I feel a real honor to be on this stage with such giants of human rights as Professor Cotler and Bill Browder. Bill, I want you to rewrite your book, though. I think we need to have either a revision or a new chapter that includes the successful passage of this legislation in Canada. And I hope you can also add a chapter about the European Union. You were telling me about where you are with the EU. And we need to make this an international movement. We cannot change what's happening in Russia. We can support, as Professor Cotler said, the people of Russia and other countries where the abuses of this kind are occurring. But what we can do is work on our own legislation to make the world less safe for people like those who tortured and killed Sergei Magnitsky. If you have not read, I'm not here to plug the book, but if you haven't read Notice, I felt like I was reading a spy thriller. I could not believe it wasn't fiction. It was reality. And we have to change that reality and do what we can as Canadians within our sphere of influence to make sure the rule of law means something in this world. Thank you for inviting me to this stage.
Thank you very much, Murray, and again, very well put. I'd also like to acknowledge on the stage, of course, Member of Parliament for Niagara West, Mr. Dean Allison, who happens to be the Vice Chair of the Foreign Affairs and International Development Committee. So Dean is going to do his speaking at the committee, so not here this evening. But as we go through our list of members of Parliament, Boris, did you want to say a few words at this point? I could. Yeah, please. You're welcome to.
Thank you. And I'd like to follow on Mr. Cotler's statement. This is a pro-Russian piece of legislation. And maybe 7-8 years ago, internationally, it wasn't clear what the nature of the Putin regime would be. People were still talking about resets at that time. Since then, we've seen hundreds of Russian journalists assassinated, having to leave Russia. We've seen what Putinism entails. It's a neo-imperialistic, xenophobic ideology that seems to be developing, but at its core, it's a kleptocracy. And it's absolutely unacceptable that those individuals who have blood on their hands, whether it's Boris Nemtsov, whether it's Magnitsky, whether it's those journalists who've been assassinated in Russia, that people that were directly, indirectly involved, facilitated, that those individuals would come to the West and benefit from the prosperity that we have as a result of our human rights and democratic principles. Especially so because they are facilitating a regime that's made it clear that they are antagonistic towards our liberal democratic values. This is an incredibly important piece of legislation that we pass, and I wholeheartedly support it, and I thank Bill Browder for championing this and making sure that the world is aware of what the nature of the Putin regime, in fact, is. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boris. Thank you very much, and thank you for your endorsement of this bill. We just have a late. I am going to get to the Senate side eventually, Senator, I assure you. But we apparently have a late arrival. Mr. Anthony Housefather, thank you very much for being here. Would you like to say a few words? It's kind of now or never.
It's okay. I think probably Boris spoke on my behalf. He already spoke.
Thank you.
Or you, Hal. I mean,
yeah.
I'll agree.
No, thank you for being here. We appreciate your attendance here today. So last but not the least, before we get to questions, we do have Senator Raynell Andrechuk here, who is a senator from the province of Saskatchewan and who has been a great advocate for human rights and for political rights in Russia in the Red Chamber. So, Senator, please welcome. You've got the floor.
Good afternoon, I guess now. I'm here to support and underscore what you have heard already to this point. But I thank Irwin Cotler for the last 4 years working with him, but we still don't have a bill. And therefore, Bill Browder has still work to do. He approached the Senate. We have levers, and all levers in Parliament should be utilized to make sure that this bill is a reality. So I was very honored to be able to introduce the bill in the Senate. It's important because of Russia and the repressiveness there. What's different is that Canada is a leader on human rights issues. Secondly, before, repressed people who were repressed by their leaders was something we could not get at. But if they are now using our systems, our countries, we cannot stand by and say we cannot impose economic sanctions because of human rights. And so what is the essence of this bill is to include in the Economic Measures Act human rights, gross violations of human rights, as a reason to impose sanctions. If the leaders who have access and abuse their citizens and their resources have a place in our society, we cannot allow that. And therefore, whether they're using our education systems, vacationing here, or using our bank accounts, we need to use that economic lever to ensure that they do not have access to continue to do what they are doing in their country. So gross violations of human rights should lead to sanctions. We cannot stand by and have them use our resources and be in that position. So I'm very pleased and honored to be with Bill and Irwin and all of the parliamentarians. And I think this bill has momentum. It does not need to be studied. It has been studied. It has been drafted very well, many times by Irwin. It is time to put it into law. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Andrzejczyk. We are now ready for any questions. Maybe start with Bob and then Terry.
Question to both Irwin and Boris, please, because you've spoken a lot to Mr. Dion, Mr. Cotler, and Boris, you're a senior member of the Liberal caucus. I want to have both of you add this question. I'm being told by Foreign Affairs that this bill has no chance of getting passed, that it's a bad idea, and that Mr. Dion is opposed to it. So, great idea to put it in Parliament, but if you can't get your Foreign Affairs Minister to get the go-ahead to get this bill passed, it's just empty words. So, you both, gentlemen, you both know Mr. Dion?
I'm not sure who your source is, but well, I can tell you that I have not heard a definitive answer, and I've especially not heard a negative definitive answer. And I know that the Foreign Affairs Committee will be studying this motion, most likely in the fall. And clearly, my position has been clear. The position of the party was clear during the election campaign, and I certainly hope that this legislation does get passed during this this coming parliamentary session.
Mr. Cotler, you certainly raised this issue with Mr. Dion. I thought at one point he was sympathetic, but now we're hearing otherwise.
Well, you know, I certainly trust your sources, but then again, officials are not elected representatives. And the elected representatives from all parties, this was one of my last acts as an MP, unanimously adopted a resolution calling for this type of legislation. The parties, as it was mentioned, in the election all undertook to pass this legislation. Now, with regard to Minister Dion, you're correct. I've met with him on several occasions, and just yesterday again, informally reaffirmed the importance of passing this legislation. And as I say, Mr. Dion and the Liberal government have spoken about re-engaging internationally, etc. This is an exemplary way to re-engage on behalf of human rights, on behalf of the rule of law, on behalf of justice for the victims of the culture of impunity and criminality in Russia. And I'm hoping that they, in fact, will undertake to do that which they have been supporting until now.
You know the Prime Minister holds you in great esteem, and talk to him about this issue, because it's not, you know, it's not going over very well in Foreign Affairs.
Well, again, I can't speak to officials at Foreign Affairs. All I can say is that I did make representations, as you mentioned, to Minister Dion, and equally made representations to the Prime Minister on this.
Sorry, just it's an issue that caucus needs to take up with the Prime Minister directly?
Well, clearly it's an issue that the caucus is engaged in. We had a session in Foreign Affairs Committee where Vladimir Kara-Murza, Mr. Nemtsov's right-hand deputy, was at, as was Ms. Nemtsova, as was Bill Browder. We heard their testimony. There was a motion presented, and that motion will be further studied. So that is part of the process.
Thank you.
Let me just add to
James,
this.
sorry, yeah.
I've got a little bit of experience with this. When I brought forward my bill to recognize the Ukraine famine of 32-33, the Holodomor, as a genocide, we had tremendous pushback from Foreign Affairs. But because of caucus, because of support within cabinet, we were able to bring about a successful, unanimous support for my bill at that time. So I would really look towards my Liberal colleagues over in the Liberal caucus to have those types of discussions and encourage them to reach out to the like-minded members of cabinet where some of these decisions are made. But ultimately, private members' bills are free votes, and so we hope that we'd see, the Liberal caucus prepared to exercise that right within the chamber.
The best way of doing it is have government legislation.
For sure, and I have no problem if the government decide that they want to take this, adopt it, and bring it about faster than what we can in normal processes.
Well, as long as you're at the podium, it does seem like a fair question to address candidly the Canadian foot dragging on this issue. I mean, the EU is falling apart, but they agreed on this. The US Congress can't agree on anything, but they could agree on this. When your government was in power, didn't happen. Question to you is it not embarrassing that it did not happen? And perhaps to Mr. Cotler as well, is it not also embarrassing to a Liberal that the Liberal Party promised during the campaign to get this done? 6 months on, it hasn't done anything, and it looks like it's standing in the way.
I can tell you that when we were government, that we were working on this legislation, that it was coming forward. And Irwin was definitely a catalyst, as a number of us were on our side of the chamber as well. So legislation was moving as a result of the resolution that was unanimously passed. But now, you're right, here we are, it's 2016, and we still haven't got it done. And so what we're trying to do is be that catalyst, either through using levers that we have in the Senate or over in the House to get this into legislation. And it is our hope the government will support it. If they don't, we have the ability as parliamentarians to vote on this and make it happen.
What I'm driving at, though, is what's the hang-up? What exactly is it? I mean, Bill Browder's been on the warpath for 6 years. What's the problem? What, in your view, prevents Canada moving on this?
Well, and as we've heard that officials over at Global Affairs have concerns, and as we see a new tone in how the Liberal Party wants to have normalized relations, normalized relations with Putin and his kleptocrats in the Kremlin, that in itself makes this a much more difficult issue. But as has been pointed out, if we really want to be on the side of the people of Russia, and if we want to be proactive in supporting their desire for democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, then this is the right piece of legislation to get it done.
On the same question, what's your diagnosis? Why isn't it happening?
Well, just let me take your own first question. I bumped into former Minister of Justice and Foreign Affairs, Rob Nicholson, yesterday, told him about the press conference. I said, Rob, we could have avoided this press conference today had the Conservatives adopted the legislation. I said, leave it that as it may. I said, it's now the responsibility of the Liberal government to, in fact, adopt this legislation. And I'm hoping that a government that speaks to the importance of upholding human rights, the rule of law, democracy, international justice, and that this is to be a centerpiece of our foreign policy as well as our domestic policy, will see that justice for Sergei Magnitsky legislation is an expression of that commitment.
Any further questions from the gallery? Well, thank you very much for attending. Oh, Bob?
A quick question for Mr. Browder, actually. Your book is full of mentions of Chrystia Freeland, who is now the International Trade Minister, a very good friend of yours, somebody who I always thought was supportive of the Magnitsky Act. She's now in cabinet. Have you talked to her about this? Does she still favor it? Because Dion clearly isn't in favor of it.
I don't think I'd be speaking out of turn to say that she favors it very strongly. I've talked to her. She's very much on my side. And not just her in the cabinet. We've had meetings with other members of the cabinet who have also said this is a no-brainer. So this, I think this, I mean, I'm not an expert on the intricacies of Canadian politics, but I am a bit of an expert on on what happens when people become foreign secretaries, foreign ministers, or secretaries of state. And the people in those jobs tend to, particularly new people in those jobs, tend to want to not rock the boat. And I think that what we're seeing here is one person's desire not to rock the boat as opposed to the right policy for the country. And judging by we have a rainbow coalition here from every different party. We had a unanimous vote in the parliament. This is a nonpartisan issue. So basically, it's just one guy, effectively, who has some ill-conceived notion of how to deal with Russia, and it's my job, and I've done it in other countries, to overcome sort of that type of bureaucratic thought process to get to the right answer, and we will get to the right answer in Canada. And we will put pressure, public pressure, and parliamentary pressure, and media pressure on the government until they do it.
I think everybody has attended here in good faith and in a spirit of nonpartisanship. So I just want to thank all of our guests from the three major political parties for being here, and I want to thank you, the news media, for being part of this as well. Merci à tous, and we will move forward. Thank you.